Harry Rickards, pioneer Australian theatre entrepreneur. On Friday the 13th of October 1911, the Australian stage suffered a profound loss. Harry Rickards, the genial, bluff Cockney comedian who had battled up the ladder to become the undisputed king of Vaudeville, had collapsed and died on the day and date he dreaded most while signing up a new batch of the world's best talent in London. When Rickards arrived in Australia, variety was low and vulgar. When he died, it was a scintillating art, and Australia had enjoyed a golden age of vaudeville which has never been surpassed. Rickards was broke when he landed at Melbourne. Vaudeville artists were scorned as a wandering, disreputable, drunken lot. Comic singers and such trash were relegated to rowdy city bars or wooden canvas shanties in the booming mining towns. The doors of all respectable, stuffy, mid-Victorian theatres were barred to them. Rickards changed all that. Grimly he fought prejudice and the ruthless competition of other theatre moguls. Many times he was near bankruptcy. In the end, however, the word Tiv for Tivoli stood for the best in vaudeville the world over. Harry Rickards, whose real name was Henry Benjamin Leet, was born in London in 1847. His father, chief engineer on the Egyptian State Railways, in 1847 his father, chief engineer on the Egyptian State Railways, apprenticed him to an engineering firm in East London. Young Harry, however, was a born comedian with a rich, fruity voice, handsome appearance, and genius for singing the Cockney ballads popular in the East End. In his early teens he ran away from home and got himself a job in a grimy dockside music hall. His father found him a fortnight later, thrashed him and sent him back to work riveting boilers. He hated it. The bohemian glamour of the theatre completely fascinated him. A year later he ran away again, changed his name to Rickards, and was given a trial at Wilton's East End Music Hall. Audiences roared with delight at his song Captain Jinks of the Horse Marines. Errand boys whistled it, barrel organs ground it out. He became famous overnight. On the crest of the wave, Rickards moved to the plushy Alhambra in Leicester Square. One evening after the show, an Australian in the audience went backstage and clapped him on the shoulder. "Go out to Australia, my boy," he said exuberantly. "You'll make a fortune there." Rickards talked it over with other artists. 3 decided to take the risk with him. They were baritone Richard Rumsden and soubrettes Lizzie Watson and Curry Tudor. With difficulty they raked up the steerage fare, and on December the 1st, 1871, arrived in Melbourne in the sailing ship Lammermoor, optimistic but penniless. Rickards made his first Australian appearance at the Princess Theatre, Melbourne. Local newspapers were shocked at the low variety performances of this respectable house. Rickards had to move to a tiny meeting room on the first floor of St George's Hall in Bourke Street. From there he went to Sydney. For 2 years he toured Australia, then returned to England, paying his way with a 3 months engagement at San Francisco. 11 years passed before Rickards made another bid for fortune in Australia. In the interval he toured South Africa, leased a theatre in Plymouth, and toured Britain in pantomime. In May 1885 he was back in St George's Hall, Melbourne, with a new collection of rollicking Cockney songs and sketches, including The Mad Butcher, Knocked 'em in the Old Kent Road, and His Lordship Winked at the Council. He toured Australia with Bric-a-Brac, a show written by Melbourne author Garnet Walsh. Then he got his big chance, £80 a week from Michael Hegarty, lessee of the Sydney School of Arts. Hegarty was a defiant, lusty character. He had been in trouble with the police a few years earlier for trying to produce a play about the Cali gang at the Queen's Theatre. Fearing the play glorified the Callies and brought the law into contempt, the police served an injunction on Hegarty just as the curtain was about to rise on the first performance. Hegarty read the injunction from the stage amid a bedlam of hoots and jeers from a packed audience. He forestalled a riot by hastily substituting another play and offering to refund admission money to all disappointed patrons. Rickards had a profitable association with Hegarty and then returned to England. Always at the back of his mind, however, was the conviction that a fortune waited any man who had the courage to organise the neglected, despised Australian variety stage. Another visit in 1888 confirmed the view, and in 1892 Harry Rickards returned for the first great gamble. He quickly realised that the only chance was to control his own theatres. The Australian stage in the 90s was dominated by the triumvirate of J.C. Williamson, George Musgrove and Arthur Garner. Every impresario who challenged the Colossus was smashed or bought out. Rickards had a desperate struggle for survival. He and his wife Kate were reduced to singing comic duets on moonlit ferry excursions on Sydney Harbour for 10 shillings a night. He had a season at the old Opera House in York Street. Then in February 1893 he found the theatre he sought. This was the Garrick, a drab, neglected building in Castlereagh Street, which had run through many names and vicissitudes. It was originally built in 1868 by W.T. Johnson, licensee of the Scandinavian Hotel, and as the Old Scan had been a popular home of burlesques, low and disreputable comedy. In 1870 it became the St James Hall. 4 years later, Jimmy Sullivan, a lightweight pugilist, turned it into Sullivan's Athletic Hall. Later still, it became the Academy of Music. In 1886 the old building was pulled down. From the ruins rose the Garrick Theatre, which lingered for 6 years as the scene of second-rate musical comedy and concerts. On February 18, 1893, Harry Rickards signed an 8-year lease for the Garrick. It was his last throw. He had almost decided to admit defeat, pack up in disgust, and return to Britain when the theatre came onto the market. The lease planted him firmly on the road to fortune. Rickards renamed his theatre the Tivoli, recruited a company of local variety artists, and used every penny of profit to bring English stage stars to Australia. When a rival manager brought out an American company, Rickards rushed to New York and signed up the best acts he could find. The gamble cost him £30,000 in advance bookings, but it paid rich dividends. From then on he was scarcely challenged in the vaudeville field. George Adams, of Tattersall's fame, tried to smash him by building the Palace Theatre, but the subsequent scramble for stars at fantastic salaries proved so costly that Adams was glad to lease his theatre to his rival. To pay for his costly importations, Rickards needed a chain of theatres in other states. He bought the new Opera House Melbourne and renamed it the Tivoli. Soon he controlled theatres in Adelaide and Perth. Throughout Australia the word Tiv became synonymous with scintillating variety. Every 18 months Rickards toured Britain and America, pouring out thousands to lure the world's great vaudeville artists to Australia. He paid enormous salaries. Chung Ling Soo, the Chinese magician from Scotland, headed the list with £480 a week. Little Titch was paid £250 a week from the day he left London. Rickards met him in Perth with a cheque for £1,250 for the time he spent on the voyage. Paul Chinchiavelli, greatest juggler ever, George Churgwin, the white-eyed Kaffir, Strongman Sandow, and Hackenschmidt, Houdini, and the nice but naughty Mary Lloyd all got at least £200 a week. Big money in the days before World War I, when admission prices ranged modestly from 6pence to 2 shillings and 6pence. W.C. Fields, the bottle-nosed American comedian who rocketed to the top in films, in 1903, with a comic billiards act, sharing the top of the bill with the celebrated Rudinoff, who rendered Nightingale opera, shadow shows and chansons in every European tongue. Later came Lottie Collins and the Australian stars Fred Blewett, Fanny Powers and Tom Dawson. The Florence Italian acrobats offered £1,000 to any local acrobat who could repeat the antics of the incomprehensible boy gymnast. There were no takers. In 1908, Rickards imported 115 overseas artists. When he was attacked for not encouraging local talent, he reported that he had also signed up 117 artists, apart from the ballets and choruses, and that he had more than 500 people on the permanent payroll of his 5 theatres. By then Rickards was a wealthy man. He had a palatial mansion in Canonbury at Darling Point, Sydney, and an English estate in Kent where he lived during his talent scouting visits to London. He claimed to be the biggest single music hall proprietor in the world, for most of the great London and New York shows were owned by syndicates and not by individuals. Rickards himself was a large shareholder in the West End vaudeville empires of Alfred Stoll and Sir Edward Moss, from whom he constantly stole their stars. Disaster struck on September 11, 1899, when the Sydney Tivoli was gutted by fire. Rickards, who was in London and heavily committed with contracts, cabled orders to the architects to prepare plans for a new theatre at once, prowling constantly round the site and prodding the builders to greater effort. On March 18, 1900, a little more than 6 months later, the Tivoli Theatre opened its doors. Like many theatrical figures, Rickards was prey to queer superstitions. He ordered that none of his playbills should have black letters on a yellow background, and swore that every show advertised in this way had been a diabolical failure. He would never engage an artist or sign a cheque on a Friday or on the 13th of the month. When a young woman who had asked for an audition began to sing Tosti's famous tear-jerking Farewell, Rickards covered his ears with his hands and shouted at her in horror, "Stop it! No one will ever sing that confounded thing in any theatre of mine." Once when a show was doing badly, a friend suggested jokingly that it was because the wallpaper in the theatre dressing rooms was green. Rickards took him in deadly earnest. Between performances he had the walls stripped and repapered blue. To the friend's astonishment, the show promptly revived. Thereafter Rickards was convinced that blue was his lucky colour. Despite warnings of failing health, Rickards refused to relax. In 1911 he was in London again, scouring the theatrical world for talent. In October he collapsed at the home of a relative in London. On Friday the 13th, the day and date he had always dreaded, he died. His 5 theatres were acquired by Hugh D. Mackintosh in what was described as the biggest theatrical deal in Australian history. The price was not disclosed, but their profits in the previous 10 years had been more than £250,000. Rickards once claimed that he knew the tastes of Australian audiences better than they did themselves. He gave the public what they wanted, and he taught them to want the best.